Welcome everyone. For those who don't know me, my name is Father Anthony Casamento and I'm the Vice President of the Australian Catholic University. And it's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the University to this seminar, Modern Slavery, What's the Plan?, which is the second of 3 webinars to help us to deepen our understanding about the contemporary challenges to eradicating modern slavery, both here in Australia and globally. As is tradition at the University, we always begin with an acknowledgement of country. In recognising Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's spiritual and cultural connection to country, and in continuing ACU's commitment to reconciliation, I would like to commence this webinar by acknowledging the First Peoples and the traditional owners and custodians of the country where ACU's campuses are located. We respectfully acknowledge our elders past and present, and remember that they have passed on their wisdom to us in various ways. Let us hold this in trust as we work and serve our communities. And as a Catholic university, it's also important for us to commence all our meetings with prayer. And today I would like to lead us all in a prayer to St. Josephine Bakhita, who is the patron saint of victims of modern slavery and human trafficking. A victim of slavery herself from the age of 9, St. Josephine's example and inspiration serve as an important reminder that slavery is not something of the past, but a tragic reality of modern society. St. Josephine is also the patron of our campus in Blacktown. St. Josephine Bakhita, you were sold into slavery as a child and endured hardship and suffering. Once liberated from your physical enslavement, you found true redemption in your encounter with Christ and his church. Assist all those who are trapped in a state of slavery. Intercede with God on their behalf so that they will be released from their chains of captivity. For all those enslaved, including those who are victims of forced labour, human trafficking and survivors, give us the courage and strength to reach out and provide a voice and comfort. Help all survivors find healing from their wounds. May they see you, St. Josephine, as an example of hope and faith. Amen. Well, as you know, this is a joint hosted webinar between the Australian Catholic University and the Catholic Archdiocese of Sydney. And the university is fully committed to working against modern slavery. Like many people, we are inspired by Pope Francis, who has urged people of all religions and cultures to unite to fight modern slavery and human trafficking in all its forms around the world. As a Catholic university guided and informed by Catholic social teaching, we recognise the dignity of each person and look for ways to work for the common good. That is why our strategic plan commits us to take bold and decisive action on the eradication of modern slavery. ACU is a member of the Australian Catholic Anti-Slavery Network, which is an Australian-wide Catholic collaboration to eradicate modern slavery from the operation and supply chain of Catholic entities who are required to report under the Modern Slavery Act. We also have other practical ways in which our activity in the field of anti-slavery occurs. For example, the students of our law school, the Thomas More Law School, undertake a pro bono program. And through this program, many of our law students have worked with the Anti-Slavery Task Force to help members prepare and review their modern slavery statements. And as I mentioned in our prayer, our new Blacktown campus, which was opened earlier this year, is named in honour and under the patronage of St. Josephine Bakhita, the patron saint for victims of modern slavery and human trafficking. Well, that's enough from me. I want to hand you over now to Jenny Stranger, the Executive Manager of the Anti-Slavery Task Force and our MC for today's webinar. Thanks, Jenny.
Thanks, Father Anthony. Really appreciate the ongoing collaboration with ACU, and it's wonderful to see all the just progress that's being made through the campus and across the campuses across the country. My name is Jenny Stanger. I'm the Executive Manager at the Anti-Slavery Task Force in the Catholic Archdiocese of Sydney. In the spirit of reconciliation, the Anti-Slavery Task Force acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Today, I'm participating from Gadigal and Wangal country. Thanks to all of our participants for attending today. and for those who may be listening to this recording in the future. I'm facilitating the 1-hour session today, which will include questions for the presenters. We have a little bit of a program change. We now have a team of experts from the AIC, the Australian Institute of Criminology, with us today to ensure that our headline presenter, Hayley Boxall, can attend to any childcare duties that may arise during this unexpected lockdown, I think, for Canberra. And throughout the session, while it's happening, there is a Q&A box where you can use that function on your screen to send in a question, and we'll get to those at the end. So welcome to Modern Slavery, What's the Plan? Last December, the Australian government launched its National Action Plan to Combat Modern Slavery 2020 to 2025, also known as the NAP. This plan articulates the government's vision for a future where no one is subjected to modern slavery. The NAP is the result of extensive consultation with civil society organizations, unions, peak bodies, and academic researchers, many of them who are participants on the National Roundtable on Human Trafficking and Slavery. In my view, it's kind of unfortunate that the NAP is called the NAP because it's not a snooze, actually. In my view, the NAP and the 46 action items contained within it represent a really ambitious and holistic agenda to advance anti-slavery efforts in Australia. And accompanying it is a significant budget of $10.6 million allocated towards its implementation. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Hayley Boxall, Manager for the Violence Against Women and Children Research Program at the Australian Institute of Criminology, Research Analyst Christy Franks, and Senior Research Analyst Samantha Lynham. They'll be sharing the contents of the NAP, information about what sits underneath this high-level public document, and a bit about the AIC's research program, which is quite an impressive body of work that goes back more than a decade. So, Hayley, I'm happy to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jenny. So hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. As Jenny said, my name is Hayley Boxall. I head up the Violence Against Women and Children Research Program at the AIC, of which the Human Trafficking and Modern Slavery Research Program is a vital component. And I am joined today by Samantha Lynham and Christy Franks. So yes, I am in lockdown. I have small children hovering in my peripheral vision. So if all of a sudden I go silent, it's because someone's fallen over or something like that, in which case my capable colleagues will take the ball and run with it. So awesome. Let me see if I can get the technology to work and we'll share some slides. Okay. All right. Okay, so we have been asked to talk about the NAP, which, as Jenny said, is unfortunately named. So the National Action Plan to Combat Modern Slavery 2020 to 2025, and also talk about the evaluation framework, which we have been working on, which underpins the NAP, which will basically guide the evaluation efforts over the next 5 to 6 years, which will be led by the Australian Institute of Criminology. However, as a more kind of broad remit, what we really wanted to do as part of this presentation was to kind of, I guess, answer 4 key questions. So where have we been? Where are we going? What are we trying to achieve? And how are we evaluating ourselves? So where have we been? Historically, Australia's response to human trafficking and modern slavery has been, I guess, underpinned by a series of interrelated bodies of work and key pillars. So this includes legislation and laws, specialist police response, which is led by the Australian Federal Police, our visa framework, victim support, which is provided by government and non-government agencies, foreign aid, research, which is where the AIC kind of comes into it, information, education and awareness raising, as well as regional and international kind of engagement. So in 2015, though, this was when Australia got our first, I guess, National Action Plan. And this ran from 2015 to 2019. And I guess the purpose of the National Action Plan at that point was to really provide a coordinating document to provide oversight for, I guess, Australian and regional efforts to combat modern slavery. But at this point, I'm going to hand over to Sam Lynham, who led the AIC's review of the 2015-2019 National Action Plan, just to talk about the purpose of that review and the document itself and what we kind of learned through that process. So, Sam?
Thanks, Hayley. Hi, everyone. My name is Samantha Lynham. I am a Principal Research Analyst at the Australian Institute of Criminology, and for the past 5 years, I have led our work on human trafficking and modern slavery research, and since 2010, I've been conducting research in this area. So, throughout 2019, the AIC was engaged to undertake a review of the 2015 to 2019 National Action Plan. The purpose of the review was to document the activities undertaken to achieve the goals of the NAP. I stress that the review was not an evaluation, and I'll go into the reasoning behind that in a minute. But what the review does is provide the basis upon which to reflect on the goals that were set and the past activities that were undertaken, and to inform the development of the next National Action Plan. So it doesn't provide an assessment of the implementation, effectiveness or efficacy of evaluation activities, but that is what the purpose of the evaluation of the current NAP is. So the review was based on 2 data sources. So firstly, we undertook a survey of government agencies who are responsible for carrying out the actions or the activities as part of the National Action Plan. We also surveyed the non-government representatives of the National Roundtable as well. However, they don't have formal responsibility for undertaking activities related to the NAP, and so their contribution really provided the holistic kind of context in which there are a range of activities that are being undertaken, even if they're not being undertaken by government. The second data source was government reports that were published annually to highlight the activities that were achieved against the NAP in that period. So the National Action Plan, the past National Action Plan was structured in a way that it had 4 pillars, and they were to prevent and deter human trafficking, to detect and investigate, to prosecute and undertake compliance, and to support victims and protect them. Each of those pillars had 5 goals associated with it, and in total there were 137 performance measures. So you can see that's quite a bit more than the 40 odd that Jenny mentioned in her introduction. Hayley, could you move to the next slide, please? So there were a number of learnings from the NAP review. The first is that we needed to design a future NAP that allowed for performance monitoring. So the review revealed a need to clearly define the aims and objectives of the National Action Plan, and to be able to link actions to outcomes that could be measured. So the previous NAP lacked specificity, and so it was nearly impossible to undertake any kind of evaluation activity to be able to assess what outcomes were the result of all of the activities undertaken as part of the National Action Plan. Secondly, we realised that there was a need for performance measures that assess the implementation, effectiveness and efficiency of activities that would be undertaken. So when developing the next National Action Plan, we thought it was important to consider how outcomes are framed, how performance indicators are chosen, and how they will be measured, which is a really key part of evaluation activity. Outcomes needed to be framed in a way that would allow the extent of change to be measured in terms of an observed improvement or an increase or a decrease in something. So the type of change to be measured will depend on the goal that's trying to be achieved, but it could include change in knowledge, attitudes, behaviour or levels of risk. Third, we found there was a need for clear and independent performance indicators to be able to link actions to outcomes. So we undertook an assessment of the independence of the measures for each of the 4 pillars, and it revealed considerable overlap between and within the pillars. And so what that meant was that activities that were undertaken to achieve the goals of one pillar to varying degrees also contributed to achieving the goals of other pillars, which is not at all a bad thing. We obviously want to have different approaches to achieving the same goal. However, that level of repetition that we saw in the previous National Action Plan made it very difficult to clearly articulate the relationship between action and outcomes, and that prohibited any kind of performance monitoring throughout the life of the plan. So we've recommended a streamlined action plan supported by a logic model, which Hayley will talk to next, and that would help to clarify and clearly conceptualise the linkages between different aspects of Australia's approach to tackling human trafficking and slavery. Finally, we realised that there was a need to consider evaluation activity, and we're very pleased to say that the government is now supporting us to be able to do that over the life of the plan. Hayley, would you mind moving to the next slide? So finally, as part of the review, we've developed some guiding questions for developing the next National Action Plan, and these are really useful, I think, for any organisation to consider when reviewing their efforts to tackle modern slavery. And that is to consider what problems the National Action Plan actually aimed to address and to focus those, to ask what the aims and objectives of the NAP are and to relate them back to the problems that it's trying to address. So what do you want the National Action Plan to actually achieve, or what change do you want it to make? It was important to understand the context in which the National Action Plan operates and what could be realistically achieved within that context. So we wanted to avoid any kind of grand statements that we then weren't able to undertake actions to actually have an impact in that area. Next, we wanted to consider what the inputs and activities associated with the next National Action Plan would be, and what the agency interaction points for those activities would be. So there's a large number of organisations, department and civil society organisations working towards achieving the goals of the National Action Plan. So how can they collaborate to achieve those goals? And then next, we wanted to consider the outcomes, both short, medium and long term, that would be associated with the National Action Plan and what the linkages would be between different activities and the outcomes. So considering what our theory of change is. So how is a particular activity actually going to impact a particular outcome? And then importantly, how do we measure that? And do we have data available to be able to report against those measures? So that provides some background context for the previous National Action Plan and what we were thinking in terms of developing the next National Action Plan. And I will hand back over to Hayley to discuss that further.
Would be good if I unmuted myself. Okay, so that's the background. So that's where we have been. So where are we going? So now we have this bright new shiny National Action Plan to combat modern slavery 2020 to 2025. So what I want to do is to take us through the, I guess, 5 strategic priorities and to talk about some of the key activities that are underpinning those priorities, and also have a bit of a look at what are the kind of broad aims that we're trying to achieve through this document. Okay, so the new National Action Plan is underpinned by 5 strategic priorities, which were informed by the 2015-2019 one, as well as broader consultation and the review. So prevent modern slavery, disrupt, investigate and prosecute modern slavery, support and protect victims, partner across government and research. So in prevention, there are a number of activities included as part of the new National Action Plan, which are focused on addressing the root causes of HTMS, and in particular reaching vulnerable groups by targeting communities and individuals who are at risk of experiencing HTMS and providing them with awareness raising, I guess, and education activities to increase their understanding of not only their rights under Australian law, but also to identify the indicators of HTMS so that they can then potentially identify and refer onwards. There's also a strong focus within the National Action Plan on addressing risk in global supply chains by supporting businesses, and focusing also on the broader community, because there's an explicit recognition that everyone plays a role in prevention. So in terms of looking at our 11 key action items, there's a lot of awareness raising campaigns that are targeted at the general community as well as at risk and vulnerable groups, providing education and advice around workplace rights and protections under the Fair Work Act, which will be targeted at vulnerable workers, the delivery of information and guidance to businesses, and so on and so forth. So the second pillar is disruption, investigation and prosecution, which is really about the first line or frontline responders and their ability to identify cases of HTMS, refer them to appropriate law enforcement agencies, and also investigate and prosecute. So key activities delivered as part of this strategic priority include enhancing identification and disruption of modern slavery, enhancing investigations and prosecutions, strengthening our legislative framework, and working closely with overseas partners, which is really positive because obviously HTMS is an international, has international components, and so there's an explicit recognition within the National Action Plan that there's a need to work collaboratively with international and overseas partners. So one of the key, or I guess flagship initiatives that is being implemented as part of this strategic priority is a targeted review of the modern slavery offences in Division 270 and 271 of the Criminal Code to make sure that they are, I guess, fit for purpose. And there's also a targeted review of Australia's visa framework, including which will have a specific focus on identifying and reducing vulnerabilities to modern slavery. So these are two very resource-intensive reviews that are slated to be undertaken in the next 5 years. However, there isn't necessarily an explicit expectation that the outcomes of those reviews will be realised within the next 5 years. You can imagine that undertaking a review of the visa framework and our criminal code will be incredibly resource-intensive, and so seeing the flow-on benefits from that may take additional time. So support and protection, this is about once we have identified victims of HTMS related offending, how do we empower them to reintegrate within society and also support them through the next phases of their life. So there's an explicit recognition that we need to continue to deliver services which support victims of human trafficking and modern slavery with an explicit focus on women and girls. But there's also a recognition that we need to be better at delivering the best types of services that we can, so that ensuring that our services are appropriate and that they are meeting the needs of victim survivors, as well as that they're being delivered in the right kind of ways. So this isn't just about basically doing business as normal, so trying to continue to provide those supports where support is needed, but also trying to improve on our practice. So I guess another key kind of flagship activity that's being delivered as part of this strategic priority is, again, another review of state and territory victims of crime financial assistance schemes and reviewing its availability to victims and survivors of modern slavery. There was consistent feedback that one of the key gaps, or I guess needs experienced by victim survivors, are things like stable housing, that they actually receive payment for services that they have provided and things like that. So providing them with financial assistance could be really, really important. Okay, so partnerships. So again, there are a number of activities that are going to be delivered as part of the next NAP, which focus on, I guess, ensuring that there are collaborative relationships between state and territory governments and Commonwealth governments and international governments, as well as with civil society partners and government partners, and with the community and government agencies. And basically everyone just needs to collaborate better. So there are a number of activities as part of the NAP which focus on upskilling the capacity of agencies to collaborate with one another and also share information with one another, but also to ensure that as part of this collaboration that we are developing consistent protocols and principles for how we respond to modern slavery. One of the really, I guess, exciting components of this is that that there's an explicit recognition again that we need to expand our definition of who partners are and who our stakeholders are. In particular, there's a recognition that we need to be better at involving victims and survivors of human trafficking, modern slavery in ongoing discussions about what appropriate policy responses may look like and those kinds of things. So in particular, as you can see against item 31, there's a specific action which is about developing a victim and survivor engagement and empowerment strategy. So what this actually looks like is a point of discussion currently, because I guess it's a broader question about how do we engage meaningfully with victims of human trafficking and modern slavery and communities that are vulnerable to experiencing human trafficking and modern slavery. But it's really exciting to see that there is such a broad definition of who partners are and who stakeholders are, which is reflected throughout the NAP. Other, I guess, kind of key flagship items as part of the partnership strategic priority includes things like providing funding and practical support through domestic grants programs to combat modern slavery, which is being managed by the ABF. So this is actually money that is being provided to, I guess, build the capacity of NGOs and government agencies to deliver these types of services, as well as things like providing new mechanisms for sharing information between different partners. So including the development of the National Modern Slavery Conference, as well as a modern slavery recognition scheme. Finally, research. So, I mean, this isn't just the AIC feathering our own nest, because obviously we're researchers and we love the idea of research being enshrined in strategic government policy documents. But it's really exciting that one of the key pillars of the NAP this time round is research, and in particular an explicit recognition that to better understand the nature of human trafficking and modern slavery in Australia, and in turn improving how we respond to it, we need to be able to conduct research and make that research publicly available, and also be evaluating the, I guess, effectiveness of the activities that we've been delivering as part of the NAP and elsewhere. So key action items that are being delivered as part of this pillar include the monitoring and evaluation framework of the National Action Plan, which has been finalised. So I guess tick, which I'll be talking to in a minute, as well as ongoing research conducted by the AIC as part of the Human Trafficking Modern Slavery Research Program. But also there were, again, additional funding being provided to academics and civil society and industry to undertake research on modern slavery in Australia, which is again being funded through ABF, as well as establishing a research network to provide a more efficient mechanism for sharing information about the types of research that's being undertaken, as well as a review of the operation of the Modern Slavery Act in 2022, which the Modern Slavery Act was implemented a few years ago and is considered a very key, I guess, mechanism through which businesses are encouraged to take ownership of modern slavery risk within their supply chains. So there are a huge number of action items within the National Action Plan which are working underneath the auspices of those 5 strategic priorities. And all of those action items in and of themselves are incredibly valuable and worthwhile. But thinking now about what we're actually trying to achieve by doing all of these different things within a government kind of context, I know that Sam kind of said that as part of the 2015-2019 review, they kind of said having high level, really aspirational, I guess, aims are fine, but they need to be linked back to something more concrete. So you know, bless us, we've gone pretty like ambitious again in terms of what we're trying to achieve as part of the strategic, as part of the most recent National Action Plan. And so the long-term aims include vulnerable communities and individuals in Australia are safer and protected. The rights of victims and survivors are protected and promoted. Justice responses are effective and perpetrators are held to account. Victims and survivors are empowered. Victims and survivors are supported. Australia makes a significant contribution to the understanding of the drivers of modern slavery, and so on and so forth. So these aims, I mean, we should have them as part of our NAP because this is ultimately what we want to see. We want to see a safe and we want to see a safe Australia where, you know, women and girls and everyone are safe from the risks associated with modern slavery and human trafficking. But I guess the question comes back to, well, how are we supposed to evaluate ourselves against these very high level and aspirational outcomes? So in 2020, the AIC was engaged by the Australian Border Force to basically develop an evaluation, monitoring and evaluation framework, which would underpin the National Action Plan. And so we did a review of the Australian Border Force written submissions and consultations, which were undertaken when they were actually developing the NAP. We conducted our own stakeholder consultations with a specific focus on evaluation. And then we also established a series of advisory groups in key kind of, I guess, areas to help us kind of, I guess, troubleshoot and provide some preliminary feedbacks on some of our initial thoughts from those processes. So the key findings from this, I guess, review process was that there were high levels of support for monitoring and evaluation, but there was, again, a need for a roadmap, a need for specificity. Everyone was crying out for performance indicators, kind of saying, I don't really know how to evaluate myself against such high level outcomes such as Australia is safer, which is completely legitimate. That there was a need for investment in data collection because, to be honest, there's not that much publicly available information about human trafficking and modern slavery in Australia, and also the need to include victim survivor voice as part of any type of evaluation work that we undertook. So what we're going to be conducting is basically a process and outcome evaluation of the NAP. So the process evaluation is really focused on how well is it working, is it appropriate, and has it been implemented as intended. So the process evaluation will be conducted throughout the life of the NAP, because the NAP, even though it is a high-level strategic document, it is also a live document, and the ability of, I guess, different responsible agencies and government agencies to implement activities listed in the NAP are going to be influenced by a range of factors that are outside of their control. I mean, the perfect example is COVID. So a lot of the activities which are focused on delivering, you know, face-to-face training and development with at-risk communities and businesses and things like that have been kind of put on hold while COVID has resulted in lockdowns and things like that. And we need to be able to reflect that as part of the process evaluation. The outcome evaluation is really about, have we achieved what we wanted, what we said that we wanted to achieve? And this is going to be conducted from about 2023 onwards, just so that basically the agencies have enough time to implement some of the activities at least before we start telling them whether or not what they've done has worked in terms of improving the safety of communities and individuals in Australia. So this all sounds very nice in the kind of abstract, right? But how do we link the inputs or activities associated with the NAP with our longer term outcomes? Well, one of the really useful mechanisms that we have within evaluation circles are program logic models. So program logic models are a visual representation of the inputs, so the things that you put into the National Action Plan, which are things like money, stakeholder resources, your activities, which are all the activities that I put up as part of our slides, the outputs, so what you produce as part of the NAP. So an output could be something like someone is referred to a victim support agency or an investigation is conducted, and the outcomes. So an outcome is a thing that changes as a result of the NAP. So it could be that victim satisfaction with the support they receive changed, the number of referrals received by victim support agency changes, things of that kind of nature. So one of the really lovely things about a program logic model is that it's a visual device that kind of helps you to identify the sequential steps that you have to go through in order to achieve your longer term outcomes. So the achievement of one component is dependent on the previous steps. So if your inputs fail, then it's unlikely that your activities will be delivered and your outputs will be delivered as well. So that could be your point of, I guess, disconnect within your program logic. So if it all kind of falls down, it could be about your inputs weren't done properly, your activities weren't delivered properly, you didn't produce the outputs, and you didn't achieve your short-term, medium-term outcomes. So we developed a series of program logic models that underpins the NAP, but as a broader kind of point, what we wanted to kind of demonstrate is that we have three kind of, I guess, active pillars where we're doing stuff. We've got the prevention, we've got disruption, investigation and prosecution, and support and protect. And these, I guess, are our key pillars in terms of delivering services to the community, upskilling our key agencies and people who are responding to HTMS and so on and so forth. However, our ability to do that will be improved significantly if our partnerships and our research are being delivered as we want and are intended. So basically, we've got partnership and we've got research kind of squishing the three kind of core pillars and basically going prevention, disruption, support and protect isn't really possible without effective partnerships and research. And then on to the side, we have external influences and guiding principles. So things like COVID. So I'm only going to take you through one program logic model just to kind of demonstrate some of our thinking. And I decided to go with research because it's only really fair that because the ARC are responsible for so many of the action items under this pillar that we kind of evaluate ourselves. So there's something to be said about independence of evaluators at this point, that we're evaluating ourselves, but here we go. So in terms of key activities, we've got data linkage and collection processes. We've got the research that we conduct as part of the HTMS program. We've got slavery grants. We've got the monitoring and evaluation framework, et cetera, et cetera. Our key outputs are our data collection and linkage protocols, the development of a modern slavery research network, research and evaluation projects being funded, and the Modern Slavery Act being reviewed and the findings are communicated. So then we get into the outcome side of things, and you can see towards the right-hand side of it that we've got our longer-term outcome, our aspirational goal of Australia makes a significant contribution to the understanding of the drivers of modern slavery and effectiveness of responses to these crimes. But in order to achieve that, we have to, I guess, successfully achieve our short-term outcomes, which include the increasing the capacity of government and civil society organisations to collect and share information about modern slavery, the availability and quality of data that can be used to measure the prevalence and characteristics of modern slavery increases, and the Modern Slavery Act is amended as appropriate in accordance with the findings of the review. Then we have policy and programs and interventions are adapted to reflect the findings from research, the evidence base increases, and the effectiveness of programs in achieving the stated goals increases. So what you can kind of see here is, as I kind of said, this sequential, I guess, step-by-step approach to identifying what our key activities are, our outputs, our short-term outcomes, medium-term outcomes, and then our aspirational goals. So even though they're aspirational, they are still really important in terms of guiding where we want to go. It's just that we have to kind of achieve those smaller, potentially less impressive kind of intermediate outcomes first. And so that's the focus of the next 5 years, is achieving those shorter-term and medium-term outcomes. In terms of evaluation methods, a lot of what we've been focusing on is the generation of new information, because the information and data that we need to answer some of our key performance indicators and research questions are not currently available. So this includes the development of an HTMS minimum data set, which includes data linkage between different government organisations, the development of a community awareness survey. So the ARC ran one of these in 2008. So basically we're going to resuscitate that and do it again to basically look at the impact of the NAP on community awareness of modern slavery. Industry and agency specific surveys. So a lot of the activities in the NAP are focused on vulnerable communities as well as vulnerable industries. So this could be farming or agricultural industries, cleaning industries, things of that kind of nature. So a lot of the activities are going to be focused on upskilling the capacity of those organisations to interrogate modern slavery risk in their workforce, but also awareness and understanding amongst the workforce themselves of their rights under Australian law. There's going to be a state of the service survey, which basically it's about assessing those inputs and activities. So are services getting the support they need? Do they have enough resources? So on and so forth. And the evaluation of pilot demonstration projects. So we can't evaluate everything in a lot of detail. So what we're suggesting to do is to basically evaluate a small number of initiatives with additional data collection and things like that to basically look at the efficacy of some of those flagship initiatives. Okay. From me, in terms of talking about where we've been, what we're doing under the new NAP, what we're kind of working towards and how we're going to evaluate ourselves. But I guess one of the key things that I kind of said was really, I guess, heartening about the NAP was the recognition that we need to know more about HTMS in Australia to be able to respond to it effectively. So the AIC, as Jenny said, has been working in this space for the last 10 years. And what I wanted to end with was to basically hand it over to Sam again to talk about what we've done in this space over the last 10 years, but also where we're going in the next 5 years to inform the National Action Plan. So I'll hand over to you again, Sam.
Great. Thank you, Hayley. So I'm just going to spend a very quick minute going over the research program because I think the more interesting part of the session might actually be the Q&A. So we should get to that as soon as we can. But very briefly, the AIC's Human Trafficking and Modern Slavery Research Program commenced in 2007, which was 2 years after human trafficking was criminalised in Australia. We have 4 broad aims to the research program, which is to identify and monitor emerging trends in Australia, but also within the Asia Pacific region. We're located, on the cusp of the most populous and most sort of densely populated region, in the world. And the UNODC estimates that 2/3 of trafficking globally happens within this region. So we're right on the edge of where a lot of trafficking activity is happening. And so it's really important for us to look to the region to see what's happening because that affects our country. So we intend to conduct also targeted research projects on priority issues, and they're identified in a number of different ways. So the research team has spent, a decade in this area. So we're always looking for where the knowledge gaps are and how we can fill those. But we also look to our partners within government, civil society, business, and industry to get ideas on what kind of research projects we can do to inform them. We also undertake activities to improve communication and collaboration between ourselves and stakeholders. So we, do sessions like this where we relay the findings of our research and keep people informed about what it is that we're doing. And that's a two-way communication. So we like to hear back about what it is that you would like us to research as well. And then we intend to publish and disseminate all of our work. So we want our research to be accessible, and all of our research is free to download on the AIC's website. Hayley, could you move to the next slide, please? So over the past 10 years, we've conducted more than 30 research projects on a range of human trafficking and slavery topics. So you can see some here on the slide. So we've covered different types of sexual exploitation, labour exploitation within various industries, the situation of seasonal workers who travel to Australia to undertake fruit picking, for example. We've covered off on child trafficking issues. Most recently, we undertook some research looking at orphanage tourism and the risks to child exploitation that that type of tourism poses. That's within the region. We've undertaken research on forced marriage and partner trafficking within Australia. We have a body of research around who the offenders and facilitators are, and that includes migration brokers and looking at the involvement of organised crime in trafficking in Australia. We've done a specific research project around Indonesian victims of human trafficking, particularly those who were trafficked to Malaysia. So again, focusing on the region, not just Australia. We have a special interest in criminal justice responses and in the near future, we'll be releasing a paper looking at the attrition rate of investigation and prosecution processes and the reasons why cases have ceased to progress through investigation and prosecution. And finally, we have a special interest in monitoring, and one of our most recent projects, in addition to the monitoring and evaluation work that we'll be doing over the next 5 to 6 years for the National Action Plan, is to estimate the number of victims that are in Australia. So that gives a fairly broad overview of the types of work that we're doing, but I'll go into a little bit more detail about some of the current and future projects that we'll be doing. So the one that I just mentioned was around criminal justice attrition. So we analysed 841 cases referred to the AFP between 1999 and 2017 to look at the points of attrition throughout the criminal justice process and the reasons why cases failed to proceed to the next step. We also conducted 22 interviews with criminal justice practitioners to get their views on what the challenges are with progressing cases through the criminal justice process. We've also recently partnered with the Australian Red Cross and Project Respect in Victoria to undertake an analysis of the support needs of sexual exploitation victims and to look at the facilitators and barriers to them receiving effective support. We're drawing on client case files, a range of administrative data, intake and assessment data to identify what their needs are, such as housing, financial assistance, mental health, physical health, as well as interviews with their case managers. Thirdly, we're interested in the role of technology in facilitating modern slavery, and more broadly, the AIC has undertaken a survey of 15,000 Australian men and women aged 18 years and older to understand their experiences of sexual harassment, aggression and violence among users of mobile dating apps and websites. And as part of that, we have included survey items around precursor behaviours and recruitment aspects of human trafficking. We've just received that data, so we'll begin the analysis on that shortly. We have a whole body of work and, in fact, another research program focused around child abuse and exploitation. And recently, the researchers of that program have undertaken a number of projects looking at the nature of live streaming of child sexual abuse. They specifically looked at the who the offenders were and how they were accessing victims, and how child sexual abuse is linked to other forms of exploitation against children. And they've used an innovative methodology looking at how machine learning is used to predict high volume live streaming of child sexual abuse. And that's mainly focused on victims in the Philippines. And finally, we've undertaken a survey of 10,000 respondents about their experiences of domestic violence pre and during the first few months of the COVID-19 pandemic. As part of that data collection, we received responses from temporary visa holders and those people from non-English speaking backgrounds. So there's several hundred respondents who fit those categories. And so we will be analysing that data for vulnerabilities and risk factors related to human trafficking and slavery. Okay, I think that's everything. We've got a little bit of time for questions. So I think we'll bring Hayley back in and Christy also, and we're happy to take your questions.
Thanks, guys. Can everybody, you guys can hear me, yeah? Can you hear me? Okay, good. Thank you for all of that talking. That is a lot of talking. That is a lot of information to share. And, honestly, these kinds of documents get released. They're a big PDF, and frankly, I think, a lot of people just don't read them. And it's really great to hear your explanation and to be able to kind of see the highlights. One of the things I wanted to highlight and ask about was I was really encouraged to see survivors acknowledged and included in this plan, and I feel like it took a really long time for us to get to that point to see that recognition. And you mentioned, that there might take a little time and ways to sort of figure out how you're going to engage them. So what do you think those specific challenges are going to be in terms of, I mean, this is the group that the plan is accountable to, right? It's survivors, really. So what do you think will be the challenges in trying to evaluate their partnership and their participation in the NAP?
Okay, well, I'll start and then I'll throw over to Sam and Christy. So, I mean, including victim survivor voice is really, really difficult in this space. And I'm going to reflect, because my background is primarily violence against women, specifically intimate partner violence. And there are various different ways in which you can include victim survivor voice as part of evaluation efforts, where you can mitigate some of those immediate concerns that you have about their potential re-traumatization if we engage them as part of one-on-one interviews and things like that. I think we need to be kind of mindful of the broader range of ways in which we can include victim survivor voice. So this can be through case files, this can be through surveys, this is through engaging with case managers and things of that kind of nature, where we basically have proxy measures of the impact of activities on them without requiring them to kind of sit down with a researcher which may be completely traumatizing, but also really not a very a nice experience for them to kind of get their immediate feedback. Having said that, from my experience of speaking to people with lived experience of intimate partner violence, I think we also need to acknowledge that engaging with these individuals on a one-on-one basis for research purposes, but also as part of policy discussions more generally, can be incredibly empowering. And it can also be really beneficial for them. A lot of people who experience these types of violence are incredibly altruistic in the sense that they want to feel like they're able to use their experiences to improve the circumstances of other people or prevent it from occurring again in the future. So I think we've already started having conversations about what that looks like, but I think in the first instance, multiple different methods for engaging with victim survivors and seeking their views. But also we need to, be careful about thinking about the real risk of re-traumatization and actually seeing it as a positive experience as well. But that's just my kind of reflections. But Sam, I can imagine that you probably have been thinking about this quite a lot as well.
Yeah, so I've spent the last 10 years interviewing victim survivors of human trafficking and modern slavery, and to get to a point where we're able to include their voices and their views in the development of a national action plan is just, yeah, incredible. I think that's what they want. I think that's what a national action plan needs. And they've been disempowered by a trafficking experience, and their consent has been taken away from them, and they've been silenced and oppressed. And this is one way for them to feel empowered again and to contribute to policies that will affect them and others who have been through a similar experience. So I think it's an incredibly important thing to do. We have a number of strategies that we use in research to be able to engage with victim survivors about their experiences and to do that in an ethical way. So we would be looking to implement much of those same processes we take for research to be able to engage their voices in this process as well. And that's guided by an ethics committee, for example. So we can assure that the way that we engage them, so the method of engagement, the format of engagement, the types of questions that we ask them are going to empower their responses rather than re-traumatize, and provide support to them if they need it afterwards.
Thanks for that, guys. I'm really looking forward to hearing more about, outcomes, right? The outcomes that you talked about with this new form of partnership.